Hi, boys and girls. Welcome back. You ready for our read aloud? Let's start with our riddle. Why did the clock go to the principal's office? Think about it. Today I'm reading another one of my favorite books, but this is a favorite beginning of the year book, and it's by one of my favorite authors of all time, Patricia Polacco. It's called Thank You, Mr. Falker. And it is a true story, and it is based on something that happened to this author. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that all the family could see, then dripped a ladle and drizzled the honey onto the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. Stand up, little one, he cooed. I did this for your mother and for your uncles, your older brother, and now you. Then he handed her the book. Taste. She dipped her finger into the honey and put it in her mouth. What does that taste? The grandma asked. The little girl answered, sweet. Then all of the family said in a single voice, yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that promise to read was at last hers. Soon, she was going to learn to read. Tricia, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather or grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Every day she saw the kids in first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read, but not Tricia. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do magic with crayons. In first grade, you'll learn to read, her brother said. In first grade, Tricia sat in a circle with the other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood. Their first readers, sounding out the letters and the words. They said, B, O, boy, boy, and look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Tricia looked at a page, all she saw were wiggly shapes. And when she tried to sound out the words, the other kids laughed at her. Tricia, what are you looking at in that book, they'd say. I'm reading, she'd say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person, and when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up into the second reader and the third reader, she alone stayed in Our Neighborhood. Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. It's not a good feeling. The harder words got for the little girl, the more she spent drawing. How she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or when she could go for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandmother were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Tricia said, Grandma, do you think I'm different? Of course, her grandma answered. To be different is a miracle of life. You see all those little fireflies? Everyone is different. Do you think I'm smart? Tricia didn't feel smart. Her grandma hugged her. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever. Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandma used to say the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming through from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side, where the light comes from. One evening, as they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven, you know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass, or you'll lift right off the ground, and there you'll be. They laughed, and they both hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that her grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were on the other side. And not long after that, Tricia's grandpa let go of the grass, too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily, Tricia would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. The numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Tricia tried, all the numbers looked like stacks of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She knew she was just dumb. Then one day, her mother announced she had gotten a new teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe though the teachers and the kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother drove across country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over the words. The and she was reading like a baby in 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. "Hey, dummy," a boy called to her on the playground. "How come you're so dumb?" Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Tricia could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now Tricia wanted to go to school less and less. "I have a sore throat," she said to her mother. "I have a stomach ache." She dreamed more and more and drew more and hated school. Then when Tricia started 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and his slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teachers gathered around him: Stevie Joe, Alice, Marie, Davy, and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. There's Mr. Falker. Mr. Falker would stand behind Tricia whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings, but they still laughed whenever she gave the wrong answer. One day she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through the page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Falker in his plaid jacket and butterfly tie said, "Stop! Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with them?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed to almost hate her. Tricia didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground and leaned in her face and called her Toad. Tricia was afraid to turn any corner for fear Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her back whenever she got something right. He looked hard and mean at anybody who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and jump out and call her stupid or ugly. And Tricia began to believe them. She discovered if she went asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during her free time and not have to go outside at all. In that dark place, she felt completely safe. Kind of sad that that would have to happen to a person. But one day at recess, Erica followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he laughed, and he pulled her out of the hall and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Tricia buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office. When he came back, he found Tricia. "I don't think you have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Tricia shrugged. Tricia was sure that Mr. Falker believed she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she could wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence. Then she'd say the same thing that he did. Good, he would say. Then one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches as they worked and talked. All at once he said, let's play a game. I'll shout out letters. You write them on the board with a wet sponge as quickly as you can. A, he shouted. She wiped a watery A. 8, he shouted. She made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q, he shouted. He shouted out many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down on the floor and tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. You poor baby, he said. You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid, she sobbed. But little one, you don't understand. You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through this all this time and fooled many good teachers. He smiled down at her. That took cunning and smartness and such bravery. Then he stood up and finished washing the board. We're gonna change all that, girl. You're gonna read. I promise you that. Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, the reading teacher. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in the sand and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going from left to right, left to right. Another day, they flicked letters on a screen and Tricia shouted them all out. So other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words, letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out. And that felt good. But although she'd read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. And deep down, she still felt down. Then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they had started, Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and pointed at it. Almost as if it were magic or as if a light poured into her brain, the words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had before. She marched them off too. Slowly, she read a sentence, then another, and finally she read a paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open her front door and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up in the cupboard and grabbed the jar of honey. Then she went into the living room and found the book on a shelf, the very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey on the cover and tasted the sweetness and said to herself, the honey is sweet and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book. Then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel the tears roll down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of happiness, so very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know, because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first he had difficulty placing me. Then I told him who I was and how he changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and asked what I did for a living. Why, Mr. Falker, I answered. I make books for children. Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you. So, the author is a little girl in the story, a little girl who could not read until 5th grade. And now she writes and illustrates several books. So amazing. I just love the story. Brings tears to my eyes every time. Okay, we'll get back to our riddle. Why did the clock go to the principal's office? Why was it sent there? Because it was talking too much. Get it? Tick, tock, talking too much? Silly. I miss you, I love you, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.